The first thing I noticed wasn't the messages. It was how comfortable everyone looked lying to my face. There is a specific frequency to a lie told by someone who thinks you aren't smart enough to hear it. A sort of melodic, over-rehearsed smoothness that lacks the jagged edges of truth. As a structural surveyor, I spend my life looking for those jagged edges. I look for the hairline fracture in a load-bearing beam, the slight subsidence in a foundation that suggests the entire house is dreaming of a slow collapse. People, I've found, are built much like Victorian brownstones. They look solid from the sidewalk, but if you go into the basement with a high-powered flashlight and a level, you'll find the rot. It was a Tuesday evening in our kitchen, a space of brushed steel and expensive marble that Dana had insisted upon during the remodel 3 years ago. She was standing by the island, her movements fluid and efficient as she organized a stack of folders for an upcoming gala. Dana is an event logistics manager. She lives for the coordination of moving parts. Lately, it seemed I was the only part she found difficult to synchronize. "Evan's coming over for dinner on Friday," she said, not looking up from a color-coded spreadsheet. "Your mom called. She thinks he's been looking a bit peaky. Stress from that new marketing contract, apparently." I leaned against the doorframe, still in my work gear, the scent of drywall dust and old insulation clinging to my jacket. I watched her hands. They were steady. "Peaky," I repeated. "That's a very motherly word for a 31-year-old man who spends most of his time at the gym or at high-end bars." Dana finally looked up, offering a thin, practiced smile. "Don't be like that, Colin. He's your brother. He's been working hard. Not everyone has your iron constitution for the daily grind." The sarcasm in her voice was a fine mist, barely detectable unless you were looking for it. I was looking for it. I had been looking for it ever since I'd seen Evan's car parked 2 blocks away from our house on a Thursday afternoon when I was supposed to be 3 towns over inspecting a warehouse. I hadn't said anything then. I don't believe in premature data collection. I believe in the cumulative weight of evidence. "Right," I said. "The iron constitution. I'll make sure to pick up some of those expensive steaks he likes. We wouldn't want the guest of honor to feel undernourished." "You're being cynical," she said, returning to her folders. "It's just family, Colin. Try to be present for once. Put the blueprints down." I retreated to my home office, a small room tucked at the back of the house where the Wi-Fi signal is strongest and the silence is most profound. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. My world is one of measurements. I know the exact tolerances of a steel joist. I know how much pressure a floor can take before it begins to moan. I also knew, with a sudden icy clarity, that the digital footprint of our lives was beginning to drift. I am a cautious man by trade. When Dana and I married, we synced our digital calendars for logistical ease. It was her idea. She said it would help us find time for one another between her galas and my site visits. I opened the shared view. There, in a pale blue hue, was her schedule, and there, in a subtle gray I'd helped him set up a year ago, was Evan's. For the past 3 weeks, their schedules had developed a curious symmetry. A midday meeting for Dana in the downtown district mirrored a client pitch for Evan in the same 3-block radius. A late-night venue walkthrough for a charity auction coincided perfectly with Evan's networking events. It was a beautiful piece of choreography. If I were an ordinary man, I might have felt a rise of heat in my chest, a roar of indignation. But I am a surveyor. When I see a structure failing, I don't get angry at the wood. I study the failure point. I scrolled further back, my fingers tapping rhythmically on the trackpad. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for the foundation. I found it in a series of private hotel bookings under Dana's professional account, the one she used for out-of-town talent. They were all local, boutique hotels with discreet entrances. The dates aligned with Evan's birthday weekend, the weekend I had been told he was going on a solo hiking trip to clear his head. I felt a strange, detached sense of admiration. The audacity required to use a shared professional resource to facilitate a betrayal of this magnitude was almost impressive. It spoke of a profound lack of respect, not just for me, but for the basic rules of the game. They weren't even trying to hide it well. They simply assumed I wasn't looking. The door to the office creaked open. It was my father, Arthur. He and my mother had let themselves in with their spare key, a common occurrence that I had once viewed as a sign of a healthy, close-knit family. Now, it felt like a breach of perimeter. "Still at it, Cole?" he asked, leaning into the room. He smelled of peppermint and expensive wool. My father is a man who values appearance above all else. To him, a successful family is one that looks good in a framed photograph at a country club. "Just finishing some reports," I said, not closing the laptop. I wanted to see if he'd look. He didn't. He didn't care about my work. To him, I was the man who looked at dirt and concrete so that Evan could be the man who talked about ideas and brands. "Good, good. Hard work is its own reward, as they say." He stepped further into the room, lowering his voice. "Listen, your mother mentioned Friday. Try to keep the mood light, eh? Evan's been under a lot of pressure. He's finally getting some traction with those consulting leads you passed his way. He's happy, Colin, and he's happy because of the support system we've built. Don't interfere with that with your usual intensity." The word interfere hung in the air like a heavy curtain. It wasn't a request. It was a boundary. "Interfere?" I asked, my voice flat. "I'm just buying steaks, Dad. Is that considered an interference now?" He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "You know what I mean? You have a way of making people feel scrutinized. Just for one night, let the boy breathe. He's found a good rhythm lately. He's finally coming into his own." "He's 31, I said. "He's hardly a boy." "In this family, he's the one who needs the most grace," my father replied, his tone sharpening. "We all have our roles, Colin. Yours is to be the pillar. His is to be the heart. Don't undermine the structure because you're feeling a bit neglected." He patted the doorframe and left, leaving the scent of peppermint behind. I sat in the dim light of the monitor, processing the exchange. It wasn't just Dana. It wasn't just Evan. It was a collective agreement. My parents hadn't just noticed the shift. They were actively shielding it. They had decided that Evan's happiness, even if built on the wreckage of my marriage, was a price worth paying to keep the family's golden boy from faltering. They saw me as the pillar, yes. But pillars are designed to take the weight without complaining. They are inanimate. They are expected to hold up the roof, while the people inside enjoy the warmth of the fire. I looked back at the screen, the hotel bookings, the synced calendars, the client leads my father mentioned. I had spent years handing Evan the keys to my professional network, allowing him to use my licenses and my reputation to bolster his freelance career. I had done it because that's what a pillar does. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small handheld digital recorder, the kind I use to dictate site notes when my hands are full of measuring tape. I turned it on. "Observation 1, I whispered into the mic. "The structural integrity of the domestic unit has been compromised. The load is no longer being shared. The secondary supports, Subject E and Subject D, have redirected resources for personal gain. Subject A and B are aware and are reinforcing the failure." I paused, listening to the silence of the house. From the kitchen, I could hear the sound of Dana laughing. A light, genuine sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. She was likely on the phone, likely with him. "Subject E's birthday weekend is in 4 days, I continued. "The planning is complete, the documentation is verified. Now, we begin the controlled demolition." I felt a strange, cold peace. For years, I had been the one making sure things didn't fall down. I had checked the bolts, tested the concrete, and ensured everyone else was safe. I was very, very good at my job. And if there is one thing a structural surveyor knows, it's that you can't fix a building that is rotting from the inside. You have to take it down to the ground. I stood up and walked to the window. In the driveway, Dana's car sat next to mine. They looked like a matched set, a perfect pair. I went back to the kitchen. Dana was hanging up her phone, a slight flush on her cheeks. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Not guilt, but a sort of impatient pity. "Everything okay in the cave?" she asked. "Perfect," I said. I walked over to the refrigerator and checked the temperature gauge. It was exactly where it should be. I was just thinking about the dinner on Friday. We should invite the neighbors, too. Make it a real celebration for Evan. Dana blinked, surprised. "The neighbors? I thought you wanted it small." "No," I said, smiling at her. It was a smile I had practiced in the mirror of the office. "If Evan is finally coming into his own, we should have witnesses. It's the least I can do for my brother." She studied me for a long moment, searching for the sarcasm, but I kept my face as smooth as polished granite. She eventually nodded, a slow, triumphant look spreading across her features. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally managed to manage me. "That's a lovely idea, Colin. Truly." She reached out and patted my arm, a dismissive, condescending gesture. I didn't flinch. I just watched her hand. I was thinking about the way a house looks right before the wrecking ball hits, the way everything seems perfectly still, perfectly normal, until the very last second. "I'll go call your mother," she said, already turning away. "She'll be thrilled you're finally being supportive." I watched her walk out of the room, her phone already in her hand. I stayed in the kitchen, surrounded by the expensive marble and the brushed steel. I looked at the folders on the island. One of them was labeled Fall Logistics. I picked up a pen, and on the very bottom of the last page of her schedule, I made a tiny, microscopic mark, a hairline fracture. The first thing I noticed wasn't the messages. It was how easy it was going to be to watch them lose everything. The drive to the coast was 6 hours of rhythmic, hypnotic static. I didn't turn on the radio. In my profession, you learn to appreciate the sound of a machine running at peak efficiency. The low hum of the engine, the hiss of tires against wet pavement, the absence of any rattling that might suggest a loose bolt or a failing gasket. I was heading to a secondary site in a harbor town, a structural audit on an old cannery that a developer wanted to turn into luxury lofts. It was the perfect excuse. I had told Dana the trip was mandatory, a sudden, urgent site assessment. She had been surprisingly supportive, her voice dipping into that soft, conciliatory tone people use when they are relieved to see you leave the room. I reached the motel at 3 a.m. It was a utilitarian place, the kind of establishment where the furniture is bolted to the floor and the air smells faintly of industrial-strength lemon cleaner. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the small laminate desk and opened my secondary laptop, the one that wasn't synced to the family cloud. I began to map the data I had extracted from Dana's professional account. It was more than just hotel bookings. It was a pattern of financial migration. Over the last 8 months, small but consistent sums had been diverted from our joint renovation fund into an account I didn't recognize. The transactions were masked as payments to EM Consulting, Evan's business. My brother wasn't just taking my wife, he was billing me for the privilege. I leaned back, watching the cursor blink on the screen. The betrayal was 3-dimensional. It had length, width, and depth. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a renovation of their lives at my expense. Evan's freelance success, the new Italian suits he wore to family dinners, the lease on his German sedan, all of it was being subsidized by the pillar. By dawn, I had printed the bank statements and the hotel receipts. I placed them in a professional leather portfolio, tucked between floor plans for the cannery. To anyone else, it looked like work. To me, it was a ledger of accounts receivable. My phone began to buzz around 8 a.m. It was Dana. I watched the screen glow, her name pulsing like a warning light. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, a text arrived. "Hey, just checking in. You weren't in bed when I woke up. Hope the drive was okay. Evan's coming by later to help me move some furniture for the party. Call me." I imagined them in the house. My house. Moving furniture, creating new spaces while I was 300 miles away. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. There was no anger, only the same detached interest I felt when observing a beam that had finally reached its snapping point. The structure was already gone. I was just observing the dust settling. I spent the day at the cannery. It was a hollowed-out shell of a building, filled with the ghosts of industry. I walked the perimeter, my boots echoing on the cracked concrete. I took photos of the foundation. I measured the tilt of the exterior walls. My mind, however, was back in the city, tracing the movements of the people who shared my name. Around noon, my mother called. This time, I answered. "Colin, dear," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "I tried calling you earlier. Dana said you're off on some emergency, on Evan's birthday week. Honestly, you work too hard." "The work doesn't wait for birthdays, Mom," I said, leaning against a rusted iron pillar. "You know that." "Well, I suppose. But we're also excited for Friday. Evan is doing so well. He mentioned he might be looking at that new development project downtown. He said you were going to help him with the structural certifications." I closed my eyes for a moment. Evan wasn't just using my money, he was planning to use my professional stamp. To certify a building without a license is a serious matter, but to have your brother do it for you, quietly, under the table, that was the kind of family support my parents expected. "He told you that?" I asked. "He said it was practically a done deal. He's so talented, Colin, he just needs that final push. You won't let him down, will you? He's so happy right now. It would be a shame to ruin his momentum." "I wouldn't want to ruin anyone's momentum," I said. "That's my boy. We'll see you Friday. Oh, and Colin, try to look happy for him. He really looks up to you." I hung up. The realization hit me then, a physical weight in my chest. They didn't just know about the affair, they were managing it as part of Evan's growth. My father's talk about roles, my mother's insistence on grace, it was all a coordinated effort to keep the golden boy elevated. I was the foundation, buried in the dirt, expected to hold up the weight of their collective delusions. I spent the rest of the afternoon recording my findings. I drove to a local library and used their public computer to verify Evan's recent contracts. As I suspected, every single one of them was tied to a client I had introduced him to. He wasn't a consultant. He was a parasite. He was taking the leads I provided, using the reputation I had built over 15 years, and then skimming off the top while spending my wife's afternoons in boutique hotels. I began to record the timelines on my digital recorder. "Observation 2, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet interior of my car. "The parents are not merely witnesses, they are facilitators. They view the preservation of Subject E's happiness as a primary objective, regardless of the cost to the secondary structure. The financial diversion is confirmed. The professional exploitation is confirmed." I sat there in the parking lot as the sun began to set over the harbor. I felt a strange sense of liberation. When you realize that the people you are supposed to protect are actively working to dismantle you, the rules of engagement change. You are no longer obligated to maintain the integrity of the building. You are only obligated to ensure that when it falls, you aren't the one caught under the debris. I started the car and began the long drive back. I didn't rush. I took the back roads, the ones that wound through small towns and dark stretches of forest. I needed the time to visualize the final assembly. I arrived home at 2 a.m. on Thursday. The house was dark, save for a single light in the hallway. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my footsteps silent on the hardwood. I went to my office and began to work. I changed the access codes to my professional database. I moved the files containing my digital signature to an encrypted drive. I adjusted the permissions on our joint accounts, not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to ensure that any further consulting fees would require my manual approval. I walked into the kitchen and saw a bottle of wine on the counter, 2 glasses nearby. One was stained with lipstick, the other was clean, but moved. Evan had been here. They were becoming careless, or perhaps they simply didn't care anymore. The pillar was away, so the house belonged to them. I picked up the clean glass and held it up to the light. No prints. He was always careful about the little things. He just forgot that I was a man who lived for the little things. I knew the exact height of his reach. I knew the way he leaned against the counter. I could see the ghost of his presence in the room, a shadow that didn't belong. I went upstairs. Dana was asleep, her breathing deep and even. She looked peaceful. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her. I wondered at what point she had decided that the life we had built was worth less than the novelty of my brother. I wondered if she realized that by choosing the heart of the family, she was abandoning the only thing that kept the roof over her head. I didn't go to bed. I went back downstairs and sat in my office until the sun came up. At 7 a.m., my phone pinged. It was an automated alert from my calendar. Evan's birthday dinner, 7 p.m. I looked at the notification and then at the leather portfolio on my desk. Everything was ready. The documentation was complete. The legal filings were drafted. The professional notifications were queued. I was no longer the surveyor looking for cracks. I was the architect of the collapse. Dana came down an hour later, wrapped in a silk robe I had bought her for our anniversary. She stopped when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of black coffee in front of me. "You're back," she said, her voice jumping an octave. "I didn't hear the car." "I got in late," I said. "Didn't want to wake you." "How was the site? Is the cannery salvageable?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the faint tension around her eyes, the way she clutched the lapels of her robe. "The cannery is a wreck," I said. "The foundation is gone. The salt air has eaten through the reinforcement. It looks fine on the outside, but if you put a finger through the drywall, the wood just turns to dust." She shivered. "That sounds depressing. Why would anyone want to live there?" "People like the aesthetic of history," I said. "They like the idea of something old and sturdy, even if it's actually rotting. They think if they paint it enough times, the rot won't matter." She laughed nervously and turned to the coffee maker. "Well, I'm glad you're home. Tonight is going to be great. Your parents are bringing the cake and I've got everything ready. Evan is so excited. He's been talking about that downtown project all week." "I bet he has," I said. I stood up and picked up my portfolio. "I have to go into the office for a few hours. Some paperwork I need to finalize before the weekend." "Don't stay too late," she called after me. "We need you here by 6. "I'll be here," I said. I wouldn't miss this for the world. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of the portfolio in my hand. It was light, but it contained the force of 1,000 tons of falling masonry. My brother wanted a career built on my name. My wife wanted a romance built on my stability. My parents wanted a family built on my silence. Tonight, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would be the pillar. I would hold the weight until the very last second, and then I would simply step aside. I drove away from the house, the morning sun reflecting off the windows of the neighborhood. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked solid. But I knew better. I knew exactly where the hairline fractures were, and I knew exactly how much pressure it would take to make them split. I spent the afternoon at a local print shop making copies. I visited my lawyer's office to drop off a signed affidavit. I sent 3 emails to the primary contractors on the downtown project, informing them that I would not be providing any certifications for consulting work performed by EM Consulting, and that any use of my credentials to date was unauthorized. By 5 p.m., the demolition was primed. I drove back to the house. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my father's car. My mother was standing on the porch, holding a large bakery box. They were all inside, waiting for the celebration to begin. They were waiting for the guest of honor. They were waiting for me to play my part. I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror. My face was a mask of professional calm. I grabbed the portfolio and stepped out into the cool evening air. The house was glowing with warm light, a picture of domestic bliss. I walked up the stairs, my boots heavy on the wood. I could hear their voices inside, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the melodic, over-rehearsed smoothness of a family that thought they had everything under control. I opened the door. The separation began not with a suitcase, but with a series of keystrokes. I spent the following Monday morning in my satellite office, a sparse room I kept in an industrial park specifically for the deep focus work of forensic structural analysis. Here, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and old paper. It was the perfect environment for disentanglement. Disentangling a life is remarkably similar to removing a load-bearing wall. You cannot simply swing a sledgehammer. You must first install temporary supports, shoring up your own assets, redirecting the flow of liability before you pull the first stud. I began with the professional credentials. For 2 years, I had allowed Evan to list me as the primary technical advisor on his marketing proposals for construction firms. It had seemed like a harmless boost at the time, a way for a big brother to lend a shadow of gravitas to a younger brother's ambition. But as I scrolled through his recent digital footprints, I saw how the shadow had become the substance. Evan wasn't just using my name, he was using my active license numbers to pull preliminary site permits. He was treating my 15 years of liability insurance like a communal family pool. I spent 3 hours drafting formal rescission notices. I didn't send them to Evan. I sent them to the compliance departments of the 3 major firms he was currently courting. I kept the language clinical. Please be advised that Colin Mercer, P.E., has no formal affiliation with EM Consulting. Any previous representations of such affiliation are hereby retracted. No professional liability or structural certification shall be extended to projects managed under the aforementioned entity. It was a quiet surgical strike. By the time I hit send on the final email, Evan's professional foundation hadn't just cracked, it had dissolved into sand. He just didn't know it yet. He was likely at a lunch meeting, wearing a suit I'd indirectly paid for, selling expertise he didn't possess. By Wednesday, the financial separation was well underway. I had already moved the bulk of my personal savings into a private trust. I left enough in the joint account to cover the mortgage and the utilities for 2 months, enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy while I prepared the final exit. It was about control. Dana had spent years managing logistics, but she had forgotten that logistics require fuel. I was the refinery, and I had just closed the valves. The first real tremor occurred on Thursday afternoon. I was at a job site, a mid-rise residential development that had hit a snag with its foundation slab. It was a dusty, loud environment, filled with the grinding of heavy machinery and the shouting of foremen. I liked it there. The physics were honest. If a beam was weak, it bowed. If the concrete was poor, it crumbled. There was no room for practiced smiles or family loyalty. I was checking the tension on a series of steel cables when I saw Evan's German sedan bounce over the gravel entry. He parked crookedly, blocking a cement truck. He climbed out, looking frantic. His expensive hair was windswept, and his tie was loosened in a way that suggested a day of high-velocity failure. He spotted me near the temporary hoist and marched over, his face a shade of panicked crimson. He didn't wait for me to step away from the workers. "Colin! What the hell is going on?" he shouted over the roar of a generator. I didn't look up from my clipboard. I made a note about the PSI levels of the recent pour. "You're blocking the delivery route, Evan. Move your car." "I don't give a damn about the car. I just got a call from the Benson Group. They're pulling the downtown contract. They said they received a clarification from you regarding my credentials. They sounded like they were talking to a lawyer, Colin. My lawyer." I finally looked at him. Up close, I could see the sweat beads on his forehead. He looked small against the backdrop of the massive steel skeleton behind us. I provided an accurate statement of my professional status, I said calmly. I don't work for you, Evan. I never have. I was just slow to point that out. Slow? You've been helping me for years. We're family. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation? I have overhead. I have payments. I'm aware of your payments, I said, stepping closer to him. I am a few inches taller than Evan and significantly broader from years of climbing scaffolds. I didn't touch him. I simply occupied the space he wanted to inhabit. I moved into his personal bubble with the slow, inevitable pressure of a hydraulic press. I'm aware of the hotel payments. I'm aware of the consulting fees you've been drawing from my renovation fund. I'm aware of the birthdays you've celebrated with my wife while I was out doing the work that pays for your life. Evan's jaw went slack. The bravado evaporated, replaced by a hollow, flickering fear. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked around the job site, suddenly realizing he was in a place where he had no power. He was a marketing consultant in a world of hard hats and reinforced steel. Colin, look, you're overreacting. It's not what you think. Dana and we were just talking about how to help you. You've been so stressed, so distant. Don't, I said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the machinery like a blade. Don't try to narrate my reality to me. I'm a surveyor. I see the world as it is, not as you want to frame it. You've been living in a house I built, eating food I bought, and sleeping with a woman who belongs to a life you've spent your whole life envying. I took another step forward. Evan backed up, his heel catching on a stray piece of rebar. He stumbled, nearly falling into a pile of discarded plywood. I didn't reach out to catch him. I simply watched him struggle to find his balance. You think you're so smart because you can talk people into things, I said. But you forgot that talk doesn't hold up a ceiling. Reality does. And your reality just lost its primary support. You can't do this, he hissed, his voice trembling. Mom and Dad, they won't let you destroy me. They know how hard I've worked. They know what you've told them, I corrected. But tonight, we're having that family dinner, and I think it's time we all looked at the blueprints together. Now move your car before I have the site manager tow it into the excavation pit. Evan stared at me for a long moment. He was looking for the brother he could manipulate, the quiet, dependable man who would always sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of the family peace. He didn't find him. He found a man who had spent his career identifying structural failures and was now simply executing the necessary demolition. He turned and practically ran back to his car. He fumbled with the keys, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I watched him pull away, his tires spinning in the loose gravel, kicking up a cloud of gray dust that coated his polished sedan. I went back to my inspection. I checked the next cable. I verified the next measurement. My hands were perfectly steady. The phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a text from Dana. Are you still coming tonight? Your mom is already here with the appetizers. Everyone is waiting. I didn't reply. I stayed at the site for another 2 hours, ensuring that every bolt on the residential project was torqued to the correct specification. I was a professional, after all. I took pride in things that were built to last. When I finally arrived home, the street was lined with familiar cars. My parents' sedan, Evan's dusty German import, and a few neighbors' SUVs. The house was glowing, music drifting from the open windows. It looked like a postcard of a successful American life. I parked my truck at the end of the driveway. I took a moment to sit in the cab, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small manila envelope. Inside were the bank records, the hotel receipts, and a copy of the letters I had sent to the compliance departments. I walked up the front path. As I reached the door, I could hear my mother's laugh and the clink of ice in a glass. They were comfortable. They were settled into their roles. They were waiting for the pillar to come home and hold everything up so they could enjoy the evening. I opened the door and stepped into the foyer. Dana appeared almost immediately, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked beautiful in a dark green dress, her hair swept back. She looked like a woman who had everything under control. But when she saw my face, her smile faltered. She saw the dust on my boots and the portfolio in my hand, and for the first time, she saw the intensity my father had warned her about. "You're late," she said, her voice trying for playful, but hitting something much sharper. "Evan's already here. He's a bit out of sorts. He said he saw you at a job site and you were quite rude to him." "I wasn't rude," I said, stepping past her into the living room. "I was precise." My parents were sitting on the sofa, looking at a photo album. Evan was standing by the fireplace, his drink held in both hands as if he were trying to warm them. When I entered, the room went silent. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive storm. "Colin," my mother said, standing up. "There you are. We were just talking about Evan's new project. He says there might be some misunderstanding with the paperwork." I walked to the center of the room and placed the manila envelope on the coffee table. I didn't sit down. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "It's a realization. We've spent a lot of time talking about roles in this family, about who supports whom, about who is the heart and who is the pillar." I looked at Evan, who was staring at the envelope as if it contained a venomous snake. "The problem with being a pillar," I continued, my voice calm and conversational, "is that you see everything that is pressing down on you. You feel every shift in the weight. You know exactly when the people you are supporting start to chip away at your base because they think you're too solid to notice." "Colin, please," Dana said, stepping toward me. "Not tonight. This is Evan's celebration." "No," I said. "Tonight is the audit, and I think you'll find that the accounts are severely out of balance." I reached down and opened the envelope, spreading the documents across the table for my parents to see. "Evan isn't a consultant," I said to my father. "He's a ghost in my payroll, and Dana isn't just an event manager. She's been managing a second life using our retirement funds." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower down the street. I watched as my father reached for the papers, his hand trembling slightly. I watched as my mother looked at Evan, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, horrified comprehension. The twist wasn't just the betrayal. The twist was that I had already removed the supports before they knew the floor was falling. Evan's career was already over. The bank accounts were already frozen. The social standing they so desperately craved was currently being dismantled by the very man they had underestimated for decades. "You've all been very comfortable," I said, looking at Dana. "But the inspection is over. The building is condemned." I turned to Evan, who looked like he was about to crumble. "And you? You're going to find out what happens when the pillar stops holding you up." The silence in the living room was not an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a pressurized chamber before a structural failure. My father's hand hovered over the bank statements I had spread across the mahogany coffee table. He looked at the numbers, the steady, rhythmic siphoning of funds from my renovation account to Evan's shell company, with the squinted eyes of a man trying to find a miscalculation in a blueprint that was perfectly accurate. My mother had gone very still, her glass of sherry tilted at a dangerous angle. "Colin," my father began, his voice gravelly, attempting to reclaim the paternal authority he had used to manage me for 37 years. "There is surely an explanation for these transfers. Evan is family. If he needed a bridge loan requires an agreement from both parties, Arthur," I said. I used his first name deliberately. It stripped away the familial insulation. "What we have here is a systematic misappropriation of assets. It's a breach of trust, and in most circles, it's a breach of the law. It was for the business! Evan burst out from his position by the fireplace. He was trying to stand tall, but his shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I was going to pay it back, Colin. Once the downtown contract finalized, I was going to replace every cent. I just needed a start. You have so much. You don't even notice what's in your accounts. I notice everything, I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. That is my profession. I notice when a bolt is a quarter turn loose. I notice when a foundation settles by a millimeter. Did you really think I wouldn't notice my own brother and my wife treating my life like an open access resource? Dana stepped into the light of the chandelier. She had been standing in the shadows of the hallway, but now she emerged, her face a mask of defiant indignation. You're making this into something ugly, Colin. You were always so focused on your work, so cold. Evan was there for me. He listened. We found comfort in each other because you weren't providing any. So you decided to bill me for the comfort? I asked, gesturing to the hotel receipts tucked under the bank statements. The boutique suite in the harbor, the weekend hiking trip that seems to have taken place in a king-sized bed 40 minutes from here. You didn't just find comfort, Dana. You found a way to make me subsidize your betrayal. The neighbors' voices drifted in through the open window. A light-hearted laugh, the sound of a car door closing. They were arriving for the party. They were coming to celebrate the Golden Boy's success. The contrast between the festive atmosphere outside and the wreckage inside was a masterpiece of timing. We have to stop this, my mother whispered, finally setting her glass down with a sharp click. The neighbors are here. Colin, please, put those away. We can talk about this tomorrow. We can fix this as a family. The family is a condemned structure, Mom, I said. You can't fix rot by painting over it. And you knew, didn't you? She looked away, her gaze landing on a framed photo of Evan's college graduation on the mantel. We wanted him to be happy, she said softly. He's always struggled to find his footing, Colin. You've always been so strong, so self-sufficient. We thought if he had a little help, a little happiness, it wouldn't hurt you. You have so much. I have what I built, I said, and what you've done is allow him to termites the supports. You didn't protect the family, you protected the parasite. My father finally picked up the papers. He shuffled through them, his face aging 10 years in the span of a minute. He reached the final page, the copies of the emails I had sent to Evan's primary clients and the licensing board. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. You've ruined him, he said. I've exposed him, I corrected. I simply informed the industry of the truth. Evan has been using my professional license and my reputation to secure contracts he is unqualified to execute. That isn't a family favor, Arthur. That's professional fraud. If one of those buildings had a structural issue, it would be my name on the lawsuit. It would be my career that ended. But he's your brother, my mother cried. He was a liability, I said. The doorbell rang. It was a cheerful, 3-note chime that seemed to shatter what was left of the room's composure. Dana looked at the door, then at me. Her defiance was replaced by a flickering panic. She lived for the social logistics of this neighborhood. Her entire identity was built on the image of the successful, coordinated power couple. You can't do this now, she hissed, moving toward the foyer. I'll tell them you're sick. I'll tell them there's an emergency. I already told them the truth, I said. She froze, her hand inches from the doorknob. What? I sent out a group message to the guest list an hour ago, I said, leaning back against the kitchen island. I told them that due to some significant personal and professional revelations regarding Evan's business practices and the status of our marriage, the celebration was canceled. I invited them to review the public filings if they had any further questions about why EM Consulting is no longer a viable entity. Evan made a sound, a high, thin whimper that was almost pathetic. He slumped against the mantel, his face buried in his hands. He realized then that the collapse wasn't just private. It was total. His social standing, his professional leads, his carefully curated image of the rising star, I had razed it all to the ground with a single broadcast. The doorbell rang again, followed by a confused murmur from the porch. "Go ahead, Dana," I said. "Open the door, explain the logistics of the situation to the neighbors. Tell them how Evan is finding his own by using my bank account. Tell them how you've been supporting him." She didn't move. She stood there, her back to us, her shoulders shaking. The reality of the isolation was beginning to set in. In this neighborhood, reputation was the only currency that mattered. I had just declared them both bankrupt. My father stood up, the bank statements clutched in his hand. "You're a cold man, Colin. To do this to your own flesh, to plan it like an inspection, it's not human." "I am exactly what you made me," I said. "You asked me to be the pillar. You asked me to be the one who holds everything up while everyone else plays. You forgot that a pillar is only a support as long as it's anchored to something solid. You unanchored me the moment you chose to lie to my face to protect Evan's comfort." I walked over to Evan. He didn't look up. I leaned in close, so close I could hear his ragged breathing. "The German car?" I whispered. "The lease is in my name. The repo man will be at your apartment by 10 tomorrow morning. The apartment itself? The co-signer was my professional corporation. I've withdrawn the guarantee. You have 30 days to find a new place to live, although I imagine without a job or a reputation, that might be difficult." Evan looked at me then, his eyes brimming with a desperate, childish anger. "I'll tell everyone what a monster you are. I'll tell them how you planned this." "Go ahead," I said. "But remember, I have the receipts. I have the audio recordings of the planning sessions you had in this very kitchen. I have the logs of every cent you took. People might think I'm cold, Evan, but they'll know you're a thief. And in this town, they'll forgive a monster long before they'll forgive a loser." I turned to my parents. They looked like strangers to me now, just two people who had mismanaged a project and were now staring at the wreckage. "I'm going to stay at the office for a few days," I said to Dana, who was still frozen at the door. "I've already filed the initial paperwork. My lawyer will be in touch about the division of the house. Since you've already spent your half of the renovation fund on hotel rooms and Evan's consulting, I think you'll find the remaining equity is quite small." I picked up my leather portfolio. The room was silent again, the neighbors outside having finally realized that no one was coming to the door. I heard their footsteps retreating down the driveway, the quiet murmur of gossip already beginning to ferment. "Happy birthday, Evan," I said. I walked to the door. Dana moved aside, her eyes blank, her face pale. I stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the fresh night air. It felt clean. The weight that had been pressing down on my shoulders for months, the suspicion, the subtle gaslighting, the pressure of holding up a lie, was gone. I walked down the path to my truck. Behind me, the house looked the same as it always had. The lights were on, the flowers were blooming in the garden, and the structure appeared solid. But I knew better. I had pulled the primary support. I had initiated the sequence. As I started the engine, I saw the curtain in the living room twitch. My mother was watching me leave. I didn't wave. I didn't look back. I put the truck in gear and drove away from the life I had built, leaving them to sit in the ruins of the one they had chosen. I drove to a small park overlooking the city. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and watched the lights of the downtown district. Somewhere out there, the developers were still planning the lofts in the old cannery. Somewhere, buildings were being erected on shaky foundations. But my foundation was clear. I pulled out my digital recorder and clicked the button. "Observation 3, I said. "The collapse is in progress. The subjects have been isolated from their social and professional networks. The financial diversion has been halted. The psychological pressure is at maximum capacity. There is no further need for monitoring. The demolition is self-sustaining." I turned off the recorder and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about measurements or tolerances or the weight of other people's expectations. I was thinking about the silence, It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I knew there would be more confrontations. Dana would plead, Evan would scramble, and my parents would try to use guilt as a lever. But they didn't understand physics. A lever only works if there is a fulcrum. And I had removed myself from the equation entirely. I was no longer the pillar. I was the one who walked away. The demolition of a reputation is not a singular event. It is a series of secondary collapses. Once the primary supports are removed, the rest of the structure struggles to find a new equilibrium, shifting and groaning as the weight redistributes itself onto surfaces never designed to carry it. By Monday morning, the fallout from the dinner had transitioned from a private family crisis into a public professional autopsy. I sat in my satellite office, watching the data points of Evan's life flicker and vanish from the digital landscape. The first to go was his online presence. The EM Consulting website was down, replaced by a generic hosting error. The professional networking profiles that once boasted of high-level construction partnerships were being scrubbed, likely by the legal departments of the firms I had contacted. Evan was being erased. He had built his identity on the borrowed authority of my name, and without it, he was nothing more than a ghost in a suit. Dana had sent 42 text messages between midnight and dawn. I hadn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew the cycle of logistics: panic, followed by bargaining, followed by an attempt to shift the blame onto the environment. She would be realizing by now that the joint credit cards were no longer functioning for luxury purchases, and that the logistics of her lifestyle were tied inextricably to the man she had spent the last year undermining. I had redirected the flow of resources to a separate account, leaving only enough to maintain the house's basic utility functions. She was living in a shell. Around 2 p.m., I drove to Evan's apartment complex. It was a glass and steel mid-rise that radiated an aura of unearned prosperity. I parked my truck across the street and waited. I wasn't there for a confrontation. I was there for an inspection. I wanted to see how the material held up under the pressure I had applied. I didn't have to wait long. Evan emerged from the lobby, looking like a man who had slept in his clothes. The German sedan was gone, towed at dawn as I had promised. He was standing on the curb, staring at the empty space where his status symbol used to be, clutching a cardboard box of office supplies. He looked small and frayed. The heart of the family was struggling to beat without the pillar's circulation. I stepped out of the truck and crossed the street. He didn't see me until I was 10 feet away. When he finally noticed me, his eyes darted around, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "Where's my car, Colin?" he asked, his voice cracking. He tried to sound angry, but it came out as a plea. "The leasing company reclaimed their property," I said, just as the clients reclaimed their contracts. "It's a day of returns, Evan. Everything that didn't belong to you is going back to its rightful owner." "You're out of your mind," he hissed, hugging the box to his chest. "Mom and Dad are distraught. Mom hasn't stopped crying. They want to know how you can be so cruel to your own brother." "Cruelty is a subjective term," I replied, looking at the box. I saw a gold-plated desk clock I had given him for his 25th birthday. In engineering, we don't call it cruelty when we remove a faulty component. We call it maintenance. You were a fault in the system, Evan. A parasitic drain on the structural integrity of this family. "I'm going to sue you," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. "Defamation, tortious interference. You can't just tell people I'm a fraud." "I didn't tell them you were a fraud," I said, stepping into his personal space. I watched him flinch, his back hitting the cold glass of the lobby door. "I told them the truth. I provided the documentation. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation, Evan. And as for interference, I simply stopped providing a service I was never contracted for. You weren't a business partner, you were a shoplifter." I reached out and tapped the side of his cardboard box. "What's next? Are you going back to the house? Are you going to ask Dana to support you? I should warn you, her financial situation is currently undergoing a significant correction. I don't think there's room in her budget for a consultant with no credentials." Evan's face twisted into a mask of pure, concentrated resentment. "You think you've won because you have the money and the licenses. But you're alone, Colin. Everyone hates you. Dana hates you. Mom and Dad think you're a monster. You're going to sit in that big house with your blueprints and your bank accounts, and you'll have nothing." "I'll have reality," I said. "And reality is much easier to maintain than a lie. A lie requires constant energy. It requires coordination and hidden hotel rooms and secret accounts. Reality just sits there. It's very quiet. I'm looking forward to the silence." I turned and walked back to my truck. I could feel his gaze on my back, a sharp, powerless heat. He was breaking. I could see it in the way his hands shook, the way his posture had collapsed. He was realizing that he had no tools to fight back. He had never built anything of his own, so he had nothing to use as a weapon. That evening, I returned to the family home, not to stay, but to finalize the isolation. Dana was in the kitchen, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the remnants of a takeout dinner she hadn't finished. The house felt cold, the air conditioning humming with an industrial persistence. "The lawyer called," she said, not looking at me. Her voice was flat, the cadence of a woman who had run out of maneuvers. "He said you're offering a settlement for the house. It's low, Colin. Half of what I expected. It's exactly half of the remaining equity after the consulting fees are deducted," I said. "I'm not paying you for the privilege of being betrayed. You've already taken your share. You just spent it before the closing date." She finally looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "You're really doing this? You're throwing me out?" "I'm not throwing you out," I said. "I'm dissolving a contract that has been breached. You chose a different partner for your logistics. I suggest you go to him." "He has nothing," she shouted, her composure finally snapping. "You took everything from him. He can't even pay his rent. He's at your parents' house, hiding in his old bedroom like a child because he's terrified of you." I felt a small, dark spark of satisfaction. Evan, the rising star, reduced to his childhood bedroom. The narrative had come full circle. "That seems appropriate," I said. "He was always a child in a man's suit. It's fitting that he returns to the environment where he was most enabled." "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a surveyor," I corrected. "I don't create the ruins, Dana. I just report on them. You and Evan are the ones who took a sledgehammer to the foundation. I'm just the one who's refusing to stand under the roof while it falls." I walked upstairs to my office. I had one final task. I opened my professional portal and initiated a formal report to the Regional Ethics Committee. I didn't mention the affair. I didn't mention the family drama. I focused entirely on the unauthorized use of professional credentials and the misrepresentation of structural certifications. It was a clean, clinical document. It would ensure that Evan could never work in this industry again, even in a junior capacity. As I hit the final confirmation button, I heard the front door slam. I looked out the window and saw Dana's car speeding away. She was likely heading to my parents' house, to the sanctuary of the enabling circle. They would sit together in the living room and talk about how cold I was. They would try to find a way to patch the holes in their collective ego, but the holes were too big. The social standing was gone, the money was gone, the reputation was gone. I picked up my digital recorder. "Observation 4, I said. "Subject D has vacated the primary residence. Subject E is in retreat at the secondary location. The isolation is total. The psychological fracture of Subject E is confirmed. He no longer attempts to project authority, he only projects fear. The final phase of the demolition is scheduled for tomorrow." I sat in my office for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. The house was finally quiet. No whispered phone calls, no melodic lies, no hidden agendas. It was just a structure of wood and stone and glass. It was empty, but it was honest. I knew the end was near. I knew that tomorrow there would be a final confrontation. They would try one last time to appeal to the pillar, to the man they thought they could always lean on. They would bring their tears and their apologies and their demands for family loyalty. I looked at the blueprints on my desk, the ones for the new project I had taken on, a solo venture in a different city. I was already looking forward. I was already planning the new foundation. But first, I had to finish the current job. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I stood by the window, looking out at the dark neighborhood. I thought about Evan, sitting in his old bedroom, realized that his life was a hollow shell. I thought about Dana, realizing that the man she had chosen was a ruin. And I thought about my parents, realizing that the son they had underestimated was the only thing that had ever been holding them up. The collapse was almost complete. I could feel the final tremors in the air. I slept on the sofa in my office that night. I didn't want to go into the bedroom I had shared with Dana. That room was a crime scene of the heart, a place of manufactured intimacy and coordinated deceit. In the office, surrounded by my tools and my measurements, I felt safe. I felt precise. I woke up at dawn. The sun was a pale, cold sliver on the horizon. I dressed slowly, choosing my most professional suit. I polished my shoes. I made sure every detail was perfect. If I was going to be the villain in their story, I was going to be an impeccable one. I drove to my parents' house. I arrived at 8 a.m., the time when my father always had his first cup of coffee and read the morning news. I didn't knock. I used my key one last time and walked in. They were all there, in the breakfast nook. Dana, Evan, and my parents. They looked like a tableau of a family in mourning. When they saw me, they didn't speak. They just watched me with a mixture of fear and expectation. I walked to the table and placed a single envelope in the center. "This is the final settlement," I said. "For everyone." The breakfast nook was a masterpiece of suburban tranquility, bathed in the soft, golden light of a morning that didn't care about the ruin inside. My parents sat side by side on the upholstered bench, their faces etched with the fatigue of a sleepless night. Dana sat opposite them, her eyes hooded, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup with a repetitive, nervous motion. Evan was tucked into the corner, as far from the light as possible, looking like a man who had finally realized that the walls were closing in and he had no tools to stop the movement. The air smelled of expensive coffee and wood polish, the scent of a life I was no longer interested in maintaining. I stood at the head of the table, the envelope resting between us like a physical boundary. I didn't sit. Sitting implies a negotiation, and the time for negotiating had passed when the first unauthorized transfer left my account. "Colin," my father said, his voice lacks its usual resonance. "We've been talking all night. We realize things have gotten out of hand. But this level of aggression, the way you're stripping everything away, it's not necessary. We can settle this without turning it into a total loss." "You're still thinking in terms of repairs?" I said. I looked at Evan, who refused to meet my gaze. "You think you can just patch the drywall and ignore the fact that the soil beneath the house has washed away? I'm not here to talk about a settlement. I'm here to finalize the audit." I reached into the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. I placed the first one in front of my father. It was a record of the mortgage on their house, the one I had quietly refinanced 2 years ago when they were struggling with investment setbacks that I now knew were just more of Evan's failed ventures. "You told me that money was for a medical fund," I said, "but it went to Evan's marketing firm. I covered the debt because I believed the lie. But since the underlying contract of our relationship, honesty, has been breached, I've exercised the buyout clause in the private agreement we signed. I now own the lien on this property. You won't be out on the street today, but you are no longer the masters of this house. You are tenants." My mother let out a small, stifled gasp. My father's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he looked at the signature on the page. He had signed it without reading it, trusting the pillar to handle the boring details of the paperwork. He had trusted my competence even while he mocked my lack of heart. "And for you," I said, turning to Dana. I placed a second set of papers in front of her. "This is the final decree for the dissolution of the marriage. It includes a full accounting of the assets you diverted. I've already contacted the board of the charity gala you're managing. I informed them that the funds for the venue deposit were sourced from a contested account. They've decided to move in a different direction. They value their reputation, Dana, just like I do." Dana's hand shook as she reached for the papers. "You took my career too? That had nothing to do with you." "Everything you have has everything to do with me," I replied. "The car you drive, the clothes you wear, the social standing you used to lure my brother into your bed, it was all built on the foundation of my labor. You wanted the benefits of the structure without the responsibility of the maintenance. This is the result." Evan finally looked up. His eyes were wide, flickering with a desperate, animal energy. "You think you're so powerful. You think you can just move us around like pieces of a model. But you're nothing without us. You're just a man in a suit with a clipboard. You're empty." He stood up, his chair screeching against the tile. He moved toward me, his chest puffed out in a pathetic imitation of the dominance he used to project. He was trying to find the brother he could provoke into a rage, the one he could point to and call a monster. "Hit me then," Evan challenged, his voice rising. "Do it. Show everyone what you really are. Prove you're the villain." I didn't move. I didn't even raise my hands. I simply watched him. I studied the way his pupils dilated, the way his pulse throbbed in his neck. I looked at him with the same clinical detachment I use to assess a crumbling retaining wall. "I don't need to hit you, Evan," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Physical force is the last resort of a man who has lost control of his environment. I have never been more in control than I am right now. You are a man without a job, without a car, without a home of your own, and now, without the professional identity you stole from me. You are a vacuum. And the thing about a vacuum is that it eventually collapses on itself." Evan lunged then, a clumsy, uncoordinated swing fueled by a night of panic. I stepped back half an inch, a precise, calculated movement. His fist whistled through the air, hitting nothing but the space I had occupied a second before. He stumbled, his momentum carrying him into the edge of the breakfast table. The porcelain cup Dana had been holding shattered on the floor. "Evan, stop!" my mother cried, but she didn't move to help him. She stayed on the bench, looking at him with a dawning realization that the boy she had protected was a disaster. Evan righted himself, his face a mask of humiliated fury. He looked around the room, searching for an ally. He looked at Dana, but she was staring at the divorce papers, her face frozen in a look of pure, calculating fear. He looked at our father, but the older man was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the new reality finally settling on his spine. "The neighbors are watching, Evan," I said, gesturing toward the window. "I'm sure they saw you lunge. I'm sure they'll remember this when you try to explain why you're moving your things out in trash bags." I picked up the leather portfolio. I had one last item. I reached in and pulled out a small silver key. I placed it on the table. "That's the key to the satellite office," I said to my father. "I've cleared out my things. The lease is paid through the end of the month. If Evan needs a place to sit and think about his next consulting move, he can use the desk. But the Wi-Fi is disconnected, and the professional accounts are closed." I turned toward the door. I felt a profound sense of lightness. It was the feeling of a building that had been cleared of its hazardous materials, a space that was finally ready for a new purpose. "Colin!" my mother called out, her voice trembling. "Wait! You can't just leave! Where are you going? What are we supposed to do?" I stopped at the threshold and looked back. I saw them all together in the frame of the doorway, a family portrait of a structure in its final seconds of standing. They looked fragile. They looked small. "You do what you've always done," I said. "You prioritize your comfort. You manage your image. You find a way to tell yourselves that none of this was your fault, but you'll do it without me. You're going to regret this, Evan shouted, his voice cracking with a high, hysterical edge. You're going to realize you're all alone. I've been alone for years, I said. I just didn't realize it until I looked at the blueprints. I'm just finally moving into a house that matches the reality. I walked out of the house and down the front steps. The morning air was crisp and clean. I could see the neighbors across the street standing near their mailboxes, their heads turned in our direction. The news was already traveling. The social fabric was tearing, the reputation of the Mercer family dissolving into the morning mist. I reached my truck and climbed inside. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the window where I knew they were watching. I put the vehicle in gear and felt the smooth, powerful engagement of the transmission. The task was finished. The audit was closed. The demolition was complete. I drove down the quiet, tree-lined street, passing the houses that all looked so solid and permanent. I knew better now. I knew that every structure was just a collection of choices and pressures, and that even the most beautiful facade could be hollowed out from the inside. I reached the end of the block and turned onto the main road. The city opened up before me, a vast, complex grid of steel and concrete and glass. It was a world of infinite measurements, of new foundations waiting to be poured, of structures that could be built with honesty and precision. I reached over and picked up my digital recorder from the passenger seat. I pressed the button one last time. "Final observation," I said. "The site is clear. The hazardous elements have been contained within the original perimeter. The primary support has successfully detached. There is no further risk of collapse to the surrounding environment." I clicked the recorder off and set it back down. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need the documentation. I didn't need the proof. I drove toward the highway, the sun rising higher in the sky, illuminating the road ahead. I was moving at 70 miles per hour, the engine humming a perfect, steady note. I felt the steering wheel firm in my hands. I felt the air from the vents, cool and consistent. I reached the interchange and took the ramp that led out of the city, toward the coast, toward a place where no one knew my name and no one expected me to hold up the world. I didn't think about the dinner. I didn't think about the hotel rooms. I didn't think about the bank accounts or the looks on their faces as the reality settled in. I was a surveyor. I had seen the failure. I had reported the findings, and I had executed the necessary response. The job was done. I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching the line where the road met the sky. It was a perfectly straight line, unyielding and true. I followed it.